Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be talking about something I think a lot of people are really fascinated by, and that's the world of young adult fiction. We've got a ton of material to go through, YouTube videos, articles, even some psychology research, all to try to figure out what makes YA so captivating, even for those of us who, aren't exactly teenagers anymore.
Yeah, it's funny how even defining what YA is can be a bit tricky, right? I mean, we tend to think teenagers right off the bat, but then you look at who's actually buying and reading these books, and it's like, wow, a lot of adults are really into this.
Yeah, for sure. I think I read somewhere that back in 2012, there was a survey that said something like 78% of adults who are buying YA books were actually buying them for themselves.
Yeah, exactly. So it's clearly not just a teen thing, right? So then it makes you wonder, like, what is it about these stories that grabs people of all ages?
Well, maybe it's something about, that teenage perspective that just really works in a story.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought because when you think about it, teenagers experience all these big emotions for the first time, right? So like that part of their brain is just like on fire, but the part that's supposed to be thinking about, consequences and logic and all that, well, that part's not quite as developed.
So it's like all about that pure emotional experience.
Exactly. Logic takes a back seat to that rush of feeling, and that makes for a naturally dramatic story, right? I mean, think about it. YA is full of these dystopian worlds, intense romances, characters facing these huge, life-altering choices.
It's so true. And it's interesting how, books like The Hunger Games just blew up and became so popular during a time when there was a lot of, political uncertainty in the real world. It's almost like readers were looking for a way to deal with all that anxiety, but through a story that felt relatable and even hopeful, even if the world in the book was, kind of falling apart.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. It's not just about escapism, though, right? YA often tackles these really complex and mature themes, like politics, mental health, social issues, but it does it through this really heightened emotional lens.
So it's like you're experiencing these big, important issues, but you're seeing it through the eyes of someone who's going through it for the first time with all of that intense emotion.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes the story feel more immediate, more engaging, even if it's set in, a fantastical world or something.
Exactly. Now, to add another layer to all of this, let's bring in the BookTube community. These folks are major influencers in the YA world, and they're revealing some pretty interesting things about the state of the genre.
Oh, yeah, for sure. We saw a lot of videos where booktubers were talking about feeling burnt out or even trapped by YA, even though their audience, kind of expects them to keep talking about it.
Right.
It's like they're stuck in this cycle of trends,
Yeah.
Like fairies are huge 1 minute, and then it's all about magical academies the next.
Yeah. And that whole trend-driven cycle really makes you think about the impact on YA literature itself. I mean, we actually came across a quote from an author who was worried about the cookie-cutter nature of a lot of YA novels these days. Is like, they felt originality and depth were being sacrificed for those quick, predictable hits that just cater to, whatever's trending online.
Yeah, that's a little concerning. So it's like instead of getting fresh, unique stories, we're just getting the same tropes and formulas repackaged over and over again.
That's exactly what some authors are worried about. And you see this happening with trends, like the whole enemies to lovers trope that's just everywhere on booktubes. Like every other YA novel has to have that now, and it starts to feel a bit formulaic.
So we've got this huge adult audience for YA. It's an incredibly influential online community that's kind of driving these trends and then these concerns about what it's doing to the quality of the writing itself. Like, where do we even go from here? What does this all mean for someone who loves YA?
Well, that's where things get really interesting because it's not just about what we read, it's also about why we read it. And maybe, just maybe, there's a little bit of Peter Pan in all of us that keeps us coming back to these stories.
Okay, now you've got me intrigued. Let's talk about this whole Peter Pan syndrome thing. What is that exactly?
So it's not an actual clinical diagnosis or anything, but it's this idea that some adults kind of hold on to a youthful mindset and have a harder time with things like, commitment and responsibility. It's not meant to label anyone or anything. It just offers a different way of looking at why we might be drawn to certain types of stories.
So it's not about judging anyone who enjoys YA. It's more about trying to understand the psychology behind those choices.
Exactly. And this whole Peter Pan syndrome concept, it might actually connect to some of the themes we see in YA, the emphasis on intense emotion, the idealized portrayal of relationships, and that desire to escape into these fantastical worlds where things, work out in the end.
Yeah, I can see how that might appeal to someone who's feeling overwhelmed by the complexities of, adult life. It's like comfort food, but for the soul.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And look, there's nothing wrong wrong with finding comfort in fiction, right? But it is worth thinking about how those choices might be reflecting our own needs and desires.
So it's less about saying YA is bad for adults and more about saying, hey, let's be mindful of why we're reading what we're reading. I can definitely get behind that.
And, this whole idea of escaping into fantasy, maybe avoiding those adult things, it makes me think about the role of romance in YA. It's kind of a key ingredient, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Romance is everywhere. First, love triangles, forbidden romances.
Yeah.
You can't really escape it. When we're looking at BookTube, there's this one video that really stuck with me. This booktuber was talking about the popularity of what they called like fairy YA or spicy fairy stories.
Right. Those definitely lean heavily into the romance. We're talking Beauty and the Beast, retellings, those possessive alpha males, sometimes even pretty graphic content,
Yeah, and what was really interesting was how this booktuber pointed out that this kind of stuff could actually blur the lines between fantasy and reality, especially for younger readers. They even brought up this concept of limerence. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's like that intense obsessive infatuation.
Oh, yeah. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
I mean, fantasy can be great for exploring different possibilities, but it's also important to keep a critical distance, especially when it comes to romantic relationships.
For sure. Because, like, as much as we all love a good fairy tale romance, real-life relationships are a lot more complicated.
Yeah.
It's not just about a magical connection or a passionate kiss.
Exactly. Real relationships take work, communication, compromise. Things that aren't always as glamorous or exciting as they're portrayed in some YA fiction.
Right. So thinking about this whole Peter Pan syndrome idea,
Yeah.
again, it's almost like some of these YA romances offer this like idealized version of love and relationships, which might be really appealing to someone who's struggling with the messiness of adult relationships in the real world.
Yeah, that's a good point. And actually, one of the sources we looked at, it was a booktuber talking about feeling trapped in the YA genre. They admitted to holding on to certain series even after they weren't really enjoying them anymore. They described it as like an emotional attachment, almost like clinging to a childhood comfort object.
Oh, I totally get that. I think we've all had that experience of revisiting a beloved book or movie from our past, hoping to recapture that same spark, only to find that it just doesn't hit the same way anymore. It's like you've grown and changed, but the story hasn't.
That's a great way to put it. It really speaks to that larger point that it's important to be mindful of our relationship with, any form of storytelling. Like, What am I getting out of this? Is it helping me grow or is it keeping me stuck?
So being aware of what we're consuming and why, not letting ourselves get too caught up in escapism or idealized versions of reality. But at the same time, recognizing that there's nothing wrong with enjoying a good story, even if it's a bit fantastical or over the top.
For sure. I mean, stories are powerful. They offer us comfort, escape, even inspiration. But it's about finding that balance right, enjoying those stories without letting them dictate our expectations or prevent us from engaging with the real world.
That makes a lot of sense. But it's not always easy to find that balance, is it? Especially when you've got this whole online community pushing certain trends and creating this pressure to keep up with what's popular.
That's true. And this is where it becomes important to think about the responsibility we all have as readers, as creators, even as participants in this whole cultural conversation about YA.
Okay, break that down for me. What does that responsibility look like in practice?
Well, for readers, it might mean being more willing to step outside of their comfort zones, to explore different subgenres to support writers who are pushing the boundaries of YA.
So like being more adventurous readers.
Yeah.
Not just sticking to the same old trends.
Exactly. And for creators, whether you're a writer, a publisher, a booktuber, it's about recognizing the power you have to shape the genre and making conscious choices about the stories you choose to tell and promote.
So thinking about the impact those stories might have on readers, especially younger ones.
Right. It's about promoting healthy relationships, diverse perspectives, and ultimately encouraging critical thinking and engagement with the real world.
Because even though YA often deals with, fantastical elements and heightened emotions, it can still offer valuable lessons and insights that apply to our lives no matter our age.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that even in those fantastical stories, there are truths to be found about ourselves, about relationships, about the world around us.
But let's be real, a lot of what gets published and promoted is driven by market demands. If those spicy fairy books are flying off the shelves, that's going to send a message to publishers and writers.
Yeah.
How do we break that cycle?
It's a tough question for sure. I think it starts with awareness. The more we talk about these issues, the more we encourage critical thinking and diverse reading habits, the more we can kind of shift the conversation.
So it's not about censorship or telling people what they should or shouldn't read. It's about having a more nuanced and informed conversation about the genre.
Exactly. And that's where platforms like BookTube can play such a crucial role. By showcasing a wider range of voices and perspectives, they can help to broaden the scope of what's considered popular in YA.
I like that. It's about empowering both readers and creators to be more thoughtful and intentional about their choices, to recognize that they have a voice and that their voices matter.
And this brings us back to that idea of Peter Pan syndrome in an interesting way, because maybe it's not just about avoiding responsibility, but about holding on to that sense of wonder and possibility that we often associate with childhood.
So maybe it's not about staying a child forever, but about keeping that spark of curiosity and imagination alive within us, even as we navigate the complexities of adulthood.
Right, because ultimately, isn't that what YA does best? It reminds us that it's okay to feel things deeply, to dream big, and to believe that even in the face of challenges, we have the power to create our own happy endings.
And speaking of happy endings, one of the things that struck me in our research was how some of the booktubers we watched talked about their own experiences with feeling trapped in the YA genre. Like they loved it, but they also felt this pressure to conform to certain trends and expectations.
It's almost like they built their platform on this one specific niche, and now they're afraid to branch out, even if their own reading tastes have evolved. It's understandable, but it also highlights a real challenge for content creators in the digital age.
It's that balance, isn't it? Staying true to yourself while also trying to connect with an audience. It's gotta be tough.
It is, and it's something that all creators, not just in the YA world, have to deal with. How do you find that sweet spot where you're being authentic to yourself while also creating content that resonates with people?
It's a constant dance, I guess.
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer.
Right, but maybe the key is to focus on creating content that you're genuinely passionate about, even if it means taking risks or stepping outside of your comfort zone.
Because at the end of the day, it's that passion that's going to shine through and connect with people.
Exactly. And that applies to readers too. Don't be afraid to explore, to challenge yourself, to read outside of your usual genres. You might be surprised by what you find.
It's about being open to new experiences, new ideas, new perspectives, and that's always a good thing.
Absolutely, because the more we engage with the world in a curious and open-minded way, the more we learn and grow. And isn't that what life is all about?
Yeah, it really is. And you know what? It strikes me that this whole conversation we've been having about YA and BookTube and even this whole Peter Pan syndrome thing, it's really a conversation about growth, isn't it? Like, how do we keep growing and evolving as people, as a culture?
Wow, that's a really insightful way to put it. Maybe that's one of the most valuable things that YA offers us. It gives us a space to really think about those big questions of identity and relationships and all the challenges of growing up no matter how old we are.
Right. Like that saying, growing up is optional, but growing old is mandatory. Maybe YA helps us figure out that in-between space, where we're trying to figure out who we are and where we fit in.
And maybe that's why it resonates with adults too. It's not just about reliving our teenage years. It's about tapping into those experiences that we all share, like trying to figure out who we are and what we believe in.
And we get to do it through these really emotional stories that make us feel all those things so much more intensely. It's like we're processing those big questions, but in a safe fictional space.
Exactly. We can explore those dark parts of ourselves, those fears and anxieties, but we do it through characters and situations that feel relatable, even if they're happening in a magical world or a dystopian future.
And maybe by working through those things in fiction, it helps us deal with them better in real life.
Yeah, maybe. There's a reason why stories have always been so powerful. They teach us, they help us heal, they help us understand the world.
It's like we're wired for stories. We need them to connect with each other, to learn to grow. And YA, with its focus on, all those emotions that come with growing up, maybe it's just really good at tapping into that need.
I think you're right. As we're wrapping up this deep dive, I'm left with this feeling of hope, even with all the, complexities and challenges we've talked about. There's something really beautiful about a genre that sparks so much passion and conversation and engagement.
I agree. It shows that people care. They're thinking critically, they're asking questions, they're looking for a deeper meaning in the stories they're reading and watching.
And that's what makes this whole thing so rewarding. It's not just about, learning stuff. It's about using what we learn to engage with the world in a more thoughtful and intentional way.
So to everyone listening out there, keep reading, keep asking those questions, keep exploring. Don't be afraid to challenge yourself, to step outside your comfort zone and use your voice to help create the kinds of stories you want to see in the world.
Because in the end, the power of YA isn't about escaping reality. It's about remembering how powerful stories can be to connect us, to inspire us, and to help us all become the best versions of ourselves.
That was beautifully said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into YA BookTube and the whole idea of Peter Pan syndrome. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time for another fascinating exploration.